So welcome today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our third Art and Dialogue discussion. My name is Stacy Brennan. I'm the Curator of Education for the Lehigh University Art Galleries. In conjunction with the Art, Architecture, and Design Faculty exhibition, which is currently on view in the main galleries at LUAG, we launched the Art and Dialogue series. This series of events pairs Lehigh faculty members with a broad range of experts to spotlight interdisciplinary research and creative practice. While our galleries are currently closed, you can view many of the works on our website, as well as lots of really great resources. And we hope that these conversations offer an opportunity to really tap into the experience and expertise of the Lehigh faculty and to dive deeper into their work and research. We appreciate you joining us today and are excited to present to you visual journaling with Jason Travers, an AAD faculty member, and Ian Birky, Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Lehigh. This conversation is extremely relevant given the current situation that we find ourselves in and the opportunity it presents us to pursue new creative outlets and to document our shared experiences and gather inspiration from the natural world. Jason Travers received a BA in studio art from Moravian College and an MFA in painting from the University of Pennsylvania. He began at Lehigh in 1999, where he currently teaches design and studio art courses in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. Travers has also instructed courses at Kutztown University and the Baum School of Art, and his work has been featured in numerous exhibitions, both locally and nationally. Travers has served as an artist in residence for Arcadia National Park, Platte Cove Preserve in the Catskills, and was selected as a finalist for the 2019 program in Shenandoah National Park. Ian Birky is the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Lehigh. He earned a BS from Goshen College and earned a PhD in clinical psychology and sports psychology from Oklahoma State University. After completing an internship at the Yale University School of Medicine, Birky went to Colgate University, where he taught courses and conducted research in sports psychology and worked with athletic teams and athletes, in addition to administering the Counseling Center. Birky came to Lehigh in 1990, where he directs the Counseling Center and teaches as an associate professor in the Counseling Psychology Doctoral Program and Psychology Department. His research interests include psychodynamic and existential psychotherapy and group and sports psychology. His many awards and honors include the Hillman Award, which recognizes exempt staff members who exemplify the highest level of achievement at Lehigh University. We are extremely grateful to have both Jason and Ian with us today. They bring a wealth of experience, both personally and professionally, to this conversation. If you have questions during the presentation, we would be grateful if you could type them into the chat box, and we will do our best to address all of them during the Q&A around 4:50 p.m. So with that, I turn it over to Jason and look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Stacy, and thanks to everybody for their assistance over at the University Art Galleries. I'm going to switch out of my screen share and hopefully pull this off. Here we are. All right, so I have prepared a video that primarily focuses on the introduction of my plein air painting class, which is about immersion experience and teaching students to get out of the classroom and get to area locations to do some painting. And then I'm going to cover a little bit about my process relating to the works that I have in the gallery exhibition. So I'm going to go ahead and play this rather brief video, and then Ian and I will start the discussion at the conclusion.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today in the Lehigh University Art Gallery's Art and Dialogue series. Along with Ian Birky, the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services, we'll be discussing the topic of visual journaling and the process of capturing experiences in images. We recently lost a wonderful member of the Lehigh University community and the art, architecture, and design family with the passing of Ricardo Vieira. I included this sketch in a beautiful keepsake book that was created by our own resident visual journalist, Amy Forsyth. The bound collection of artwork and well wishes from the department faculty was presented to Ricardo at his retirement party. Amy's portrait wonderfully captures Ricardo's beaming presence. I chose to include this sketch from St. Michael's Cemetery, just a few blocks from campus. The cemetery, with its beautiful views of the valley and steel mill below, was a regular sketching spot when I resided on East 5th Street. It was also the location of Walker Evans' iconic photograph from 1935. It seemed a fitting tribute to Ricardo's contributions to the gallery and his love of photography as well. Ricardo will be dearly missed by us all.
I also want to give a shout out to our students who have all been working incredibly hard under some very difficult circumstances. Transitioning the traditional studio classes to an online platform has been difficult to say the least, but I want to credit our students for rising to the challenge. We've all had to adapt to technology in order to facilitate that sense of one-on-one interaction that's so vital to our studio courses. At times it can feel helpless not being able to look over a student's shoulder and offer tips and advice as they work on their assignments, but it's been very exciting to see the progress images posted on the blogs. It's also my hope that students are finding some much-needed respite in these creative assignments. For many of the students in our studio courses, there's an immersion in the process that's very different from their traditional academic courses. Oftentimes, I've heard students comment how quickly time passes during class. Working for 3 hours on a portrait, a still life, a painting, or a sculpture gives students a rare opportunity to work undistracted. It's also a reminder that we're all completely inundated with distractions in our day-to-day life. After teaching a summer session painting course in the sweltering heat of the top floor of Copay Hall almost 20 years ago, I came up with the concept of teaching the plein air painting course. The course was designed to be a departure from the traditional academic class, and even a departure from the traditional studio class, in that the emphasis would be on immersion of experience and not so much on the end product of the paintings. The group I recruited for that first summer session made that abundantly clear. Since it was before the time of GPS, we spent most of the class trips traveling around trying to find trailheads and generally getting lost. In addition to selling the class on exquisite swimming spots, adventurous hikes, and mandatory ice cream after class, it also presented an idyllic vision of what plein air painting appeared to be. Our students are hardworking and used to excelling in all of their academic challenges. And thanks to the half-hour mastery of Bob Ross, they have rather unrealistic expectations of their first foray into landscape painting. What the students discover, however, is that the work becomes secondary to the experiences of the class. As I look through the photo galleries on the course website over the years, they're littered with memorable stories from the class. A run-in with a lengthy rat snake at Bake Oven Knob, rescuing a turtle from fishing line along the Delaware, collecting frogs at Jacobsburg Park, an EMT student rescuing a hiker at Glenanoco, and a student meeting her first Appalachian Trail hiker again at Bake Oven Knob. It's these experiences, as well as the banter on the trails and the lengthy car rides, that students will remember from the class. In addition to exercises and artwork created in the class, I also require that the students keep a travel journal. While these journals do include reflections of the trials and tribulations of the introduction to landscape painting, they're almost entirely comprised of anecdotes and reflections from the experiences of the course. While some of these journals are more formal, others are extremely creative. Some include illustrations, used palettes, squished bugs, and other keepsakes from the excursions. At the conclusion of the journal, I ask the students to write a summary of their overall experience. These summaries are often very moving as students recount some of the epiphanies they've had as a result of taking the class. It's not uncommon that painting isn't the primary topic in this summary. To quote from one of the pieces on this slide, "I stopped thinking of class and I started thinking about experience. I was with great people and I stopped thinking about what I was doing and was just going with it." While hiking, adventures, and camaraderie are all a significant part of the course, there is still some art making that needs to be done. Since there are a significant number of students who enter the course with no prior experience in art making, I designed several exercises to introduce students to a basic strategy for approaching the landscape. But even with instruction, students are bound to struggle with the complexities of the landscape. And this is where the blind contour drawing comes in handy. If you're not familiar with the concept of a blind contour drawing, the process involves keeping the eyes fixated on the subject, the pencil fixated on the paper, but the eyes are not allowed to view the paper while drawing. As a result, the drawings have very unique characteristics, which initially the students find to be very childlike. For the past few years, I've integrated a group blind contour drawing at the conclusion of each plein air painting excursion.
We all set up together in a scenic location while one student keeps time. Even 5 minutes can feel like a lifetime when you're doing a blind contour drawing. As they continue to work on their drawing, their attention remains solely fixed on the landscape. By relinquishing concern for the accuracy of the depiction, there's a beautiful honesty that prevails. This is pure art making without pretense and documentation of a unique experience. Both blind contour and continuous line drawings remain an essential part of my practice as well. Several years ago, I was part of a self-portrait exhibition and decided to use the time over spring break to create a series of over 50 blind contour self-portraits. The results were comical at times, but it was also a very liberating creative experience. In much of the same way that I valued this exercise for my students, it also helped me remove pretense from my own process. I also use the blind contour and continuous line drawings as a mental break when I'm working on site in nature, or even just having a coffee and watching my cat hopped up on catnip. Here's a trio of beautiful continuous line drawings by my good friend and artist Greg Furjanic. Even if you haven't drawn before, I highly recommend giving these techniques a shot. They're just a lot of fun. I want to move on to discuss the 4 works that I have on view in the faculty exhibition in the Lehigh University Art Gallery in the Zollner Center. All 4 images are landscape drawings completed on-site utilizing India ink. I included the following statement about my work for the exhibition. After many years primarily producing non-representational work, I have gravitated toward observed landscape studies using ink and water-soluble graphite to facilitate my hiking explorations with a more limited yet accessible medium. These sketches range in duration from an hour or 2 to multiple day sittings and are always completed on site. The experience of recording these observations, visually surveying every detail and nuance of my surroundings, results in a product that documents the full experience in a way that a simple memory or camera snapshot could never replicate. When I revisit each of my completed sketches, I am instantly transported back to a specific place and time and can recount every sensory facet of the experience. These works become a journal of my collective experiences. My interest in ink goes back to my days at Moravian College. We had an assignment in which we had to research the ink drawings done by Vincent van Gogh utilizing reed pens. Following that assignment, I continued to use the ink extensively. Primarily working from the figure, I experimented with different types of mark making and brushes. I found a sense of boldness and immediacy in the ink that gave the work a newfound sense of confidence. Later that year, I would have my first opportunity to study abroad in Italy, and the sketches I created would be the start of a lifelong journal of my travel experiences. The gestural approach of the ink drawings was ideal for the brief stops and lunch breaks during our travels. While pursuing my MFA at Penn, there was an emphasis on abandoning representational imagery in favor of exploring the more philosophical routes that served as the basis for my desire to create. Though the abstractions I created clearly referenced the landscape, the approach was much more visceral and allowed for the image to surface in a more subconscious way. During the summer months, my treks across the country exploring diverse national parks were inspirational and influential once I returned to the studio. The landscape work I created on these trips served more as a personal diary of my travel experiences and for the most part was rarely shared with my studio critics. Years later, I would begin focusing more intently on the landscape. While I was still working non-representationally in the studio, I would supplement my opportunities to get outside with these more detailed ink drawings that were created in a bound sketchbook. Within a few years, I had amassed several volumes with each drawing notating the date and location. I was hesitant to disassemble these books, but opted to exhibit some of the drawings alongside my abstractions in an exhibition at Moravian College. I included this statement to explain the relativity of the two. In the process of recording direct observations in nature, there is a heightened experience created through the intensive visual exploration of the space. The artist becomes keenly aware in this communion, and the sketch or painting in turn becomes a visual diary of a very personal experience. While the products of my studio work forego the necessity of the observed subject, the connection remains the same. It's the desire to experience a unique visual voyage of discovery. I began to seek out new opportunities and was fortunate enough to serve as artist in residence at Acadia National Park in Maine. My first week was spent on Mount Desert Island, where I continued to produce numerous sketches and watercolor paintings. I worked manically from morning to night trying to capitalize on the opportunity and soon became aware that I was putting undue pressure on myself. I was beginning to lose sight of the enjoyment of the process until a fateful run-in with a family from New Hampshire. Their young daughter broke out her supplies beside me and proceeded to offer me detailed explanations from her own trove of drawings. She was easily the most inspiring artist I encountered during the residency. supreme conviction and passion without pretense. She also suggested I should use more color, to which I complied. I spent the remainder of the residency on the more isolated Schoodic Peninsula, just north of Mount Desert Island. I received a tip from the locals about Raven's Nest, a beautiful spot that was not listed on any of the park maps due to the danger of the precarious terrain. Prior to the residency, I had been experimenting with a new polypropylene surface that had been a revelation. I completed the first polypropylene drawing at Raven's Nest in a 3-hour sitting in the late day sun. It was a groundbreaking image that would create momentum for my return to the studio. And here's the view from my perch atop Raven's Nest along with the bald eagle that kept me company for a better part of the day. A pretty magical moment. The next polypropylene drawing was created near Winter Harbor and also inspired by a chance run-in with a local theater director in the small fishing town of Korea. I have to credit Ian Birky with the suggestion to visit Korea, not to mention the fantastic lobster roll and lobster grilled cheese sandwiches available at the Wharf Lunch, which also sported a fine collection of Marsden and Hartley artwork. And here's one last polypropylene drawing created along the shoreline of the Schoodic Peninsula, along with a process image of how I build up the drawings on the surface. And these are some of the follow-up drawings I did on my return from the residency. And some paintings utilizing watercolor on the polypropylene surface. The final 3 pieces in the exhibition are all from this past summer. Moose River Plains is a vast stretch of wilderness in the Adirondacks. I've been camping in this remote area for almost 20 years, spending much of the time sketching along the rolling falls of the Otter Brook. And here are some additional sketches from Moose River Plains, including my primitive outhouse in the middle of the woods, and a few more from Otter Brook. The third drawing in the exhibition was created at Glenanoco Falls. A unanimous favorite hike of the plein air painting students, the Glenanoco Falls trailhead was officially closed this last summer due to numerous accidents along the perilous terrain, and there are my students from last summer's class rather dejected at not being able to hike the falls. And here's my drawing, created safely at the base of the falls, where the only thing I have to worry about are the rattlesnakes. And the final drawing was created at another popular destination of the plein air painting class, Ringing Rocks Park in Bucks County. And here my only concern was unattended children hurling rocks at me from the top of the ravine. To borrow an acronym coined by my plein air painting students whenever something memorable would occur, PITJ, put it in the journal.
All right, so I'm going to keep these images handy. If Ian has any questions that we can scroll back through these, but thank you for listening to the presentation. Really designed with my students in mind. I certainly want to kind of let them see some of the experience that I've had as a visual artist, and also a little bit about my teaching philosophies and the experiences that I want them to have. So Ian and I talked a little bit yesterday about the current climate and the situations we're dealing with, and this fatigue that we're all having from this change in routine that's been very sudden and unusual to our kind of our balance that we usually have in life, that we're spending so much time now at our computer screens. So Ian, maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about your thoughts on that and how this is affecting us. And you talk about specifically how your role has changed and how you have to basically do your job from the computer all the time. So what effects are we seeing from this?
Thank you, Jason. And I would actually start my comments by specifically thanking you for presenting to us something that stimulates us in ways that we might otherwise not have been stimulated today. The thing I've been talking a lot with about the students that I'm seeing on Zoom and online with my professional friends and with the coaches and athletes that I work with is that I think one of the things we're all experiencing by sitting in our rooms much more than we ever did before is that we're the stimulus value in our lives is going down gradually, chronically, persistently, day after day after day. And what we know happens psychologically, neurochemically, is that when stimulation decreases, our brains gradually begin to slow down. And so anything that we can do to stimulate ourselves or to find new stimulations when we're looking at sometimes a room size of maybe an 8 by 10. One of my staff is actually having to do her work in her bathroom because that's the only private space in her office. That anything that we can do to try to increase stimulation activates our mind. If we don't do it, most of us across time are going to become what we call gradually more and more dysthymic. And so all to say, I appreciate you putting something in front of me that stimulates me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but stimulates me in all the different ways, cognitively, intellectually, physically, and emotionally. And those are the kind of things that we should feel so much gratitude if we get experience that.
I think it was interesting, in addition to our work lives, which have dramatically changed, you were talking about things like Netflix and Zoom and Skype, and the fact that even though we're watching an adventure movie on TV and there's all this stimulation, and I find that without the physical stimulation, in addition to that, it does leave you kind of mentally drained and exhausted.
Yes.
And this is actually a good tie-in because my students are starting figure drawing and drawing class today. God bless their family members for serving as impromptu models. But it's one of these traditional studio assignments where you just wonder, how are we going to create that same sense it's such a unique opportunity in the classroom. And students asked, well, would it be okay if I just look at pictures online? And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. I don't mean to kind of poo-poo the idea of people drawing from photographs, but to me, it's really important to be physically in a space. And, the South Pole, where they're using a grid transposition. Photographs are a great way to learn to analyze things in a more objective way. But for me personally, as a tie-in to all the work, it's missing that immersion in an incomplete environment and the sensory, the sensory facets of that. And I appreciate you're such a nature lover yourself that what you bring to the work is reflections from your own experiences. So it has been fun for me also just to kind of put this together and relive these experiences. And obviously I love the stories that go with all of them. So I think that really kind of encompasses the importance of visual journaling to me.
Jason and I were talking the other day that I've been in just about all these places that Jason has done drawing. I've been to Acadia probably 4 or 5 times and hiked just about every trail and seen down through those spots that he's taken. And that spot there is very familiar to me in real life. I was reading an article just recently about a therapy that's been provided to some of the people in the refugee camps in Africa, and it's called eidetic therapy. And what it does is it teaches people how to use and to recall and to make come alive the memories they have about experiences in their lives. And so one of the things that just both with the athletes that we work with as well as the students, and all of heard this term anymore, you're probably getting sick of it like me, is mindfulness. So if I was to give you an example of how we can use mindfulness, even though we're looking at something 18 inches in front of our face, which evolutionary wise we cannot have much experience with when we through the last 60,000 years at least have looked at broad vistas and up close and then at distance. But here's the way to use mindfulness. Look at the picture that Jason has up here now. So I'm a huge museum fan and usually spend maybe even 2-3 weeks a year going into the Chelsea district in New York and just going through all the galleries. But when we look at a picture like this, and by the way, I was just at the Cleveland Art Museum the day before they closed the city in Cleveland because of the COVID. But when you look at a picture like this, what mindfulness means is that you pause long enough to begin to sense what the stimulation of that picture is to you. And if we started from that, just physically, it's like when I look at a picture like that, what does it make my body feel like doing, or how does it make my body feel? And you know, for any of you who've been into this particular spot on the island up by Acadia, you may feel yourself feeling a little bit anxious looking at the steepness of those cliffs. And if you're a rock climber, which I have done a lot of, it also draws you in and makes you want to grab hold of that rock and see if you can master it. So that's just at the physical level. If you think about that from a cognitive level, and I know those of you who are art aficionados, when you go into the museum, sometimes you find yourself looking at the picture, but then you're drawn in really close to wondering, how did the person make those particular brush strokes? What was going on? And Jason's already shared with us the idea of kind of what goes on internally for him when he's trying to capture something both out there, and he maybe didn't speak so much about it, but I'm also guessing what becomes inside that he needs to get out onto that canvas. And that's some of the kind of the cognitive intellectual process. Can I capture it in a way that I'm feeling it inside? And then I think that the last stimulation, if we're just paying attention to the inside, and when you note stimulation, I think it actually increases the stimulus value to yourself. So emotionally, what does a picture like that do? And for me, emotionally, just the fact that he takes and simplifies some of that picture into almost canvases in the picture, those white rocks that allow me to project onto that, even some of my memories of, well, I tended to look into the water in this kind of an area, and there's very few left there, but the starfish that used to be down at the base of those cliffs, and then through the years of watching those starfish gradually disappear more and more as a result of some of the ecologic changes that are, the sadness that goes with that. And yet at the same time, the beauty of the water leaves me with kind of an emotional feeling. It takes me to a lot of different places. And what we know from eidetic therapy and the whole theory about that is going through all those emotional, behavioral, and cognitive kind of experiences related to even pictures it gets you in touch with the quality of your own life and the meaning of that. And I just, that's why I like at art, and that's why I appreciate having an artist friend like Jason, that we can sit in the locker room at Taylor sometimes after a hard workout and trade stories about, were you just at the MoMA and saw those particular pictures, or over at the Whitney, or back to the Chicago Art Museum or into the Philly Art Museum. So my thoughts on that, Jason.
Well, that's a great lead-in, because you had discussed why I was drawn to this particular piece. Because for me, I mentioned that it was groundbreaking. And I didn't show any of my earlier abstract work, but for me, and Michael and Nick were talking about this last week, as far as these kind of, how people are intimidated by artwork that they don't understand how to talk about. And I think back to what the abstract expression is, seeing Jackson Pollock and de Kooning's painting and that history, as you were talking, of the mark making on the surface. There was something so romantic about the fact that you weren't polishing away the fact that you were making a piece of art. So that's something you could see in my older work. I was really drawn to the gesture. And in a lot of ways, I'm kind of a risk painter. It's all or nothing. And there's going to be failures when you work with that boldness. And there are a lot of failures. And psychologically, I think that could be a difficult way to work when you're just trying to capture lightning in a bottle. But I think that confidence, and again, as my students are having their first foray into working with the figure, I want them to see the boldness and the recklessness. I want them to do blind contour drawings. I want them to do wild ink drawings. But this drawing for me was the first of the landscape pieces that kind of made a connection to what I was doing with the abstractions. I also wanted to go back, because yesterday you had mentioned your fondness for the ink pen series, and in particular, one of my favorite rocks in the Adirondacks here. So do you want to talk about why you're drawn to this particular series and that image?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm one of those kind of people that even at Christmas time has gotten a certain pleasure at times out of purchasing to put in my house the Charlie Brown Christmas tree, because sometimes in its simplicity, there's almost a kind of waifness about that captures kind of essence of soul that's down to the kind of the simple parts of it. And so the picture that he has on the bottom left side, that picture just catches my attention for one thing, because it's a vista, but in front of it, it also shows kind of the struggle, the life and death, the simplicity of that. But the rock just above that, I've always been kind of fascinated by, I have a place up in the Poconos, and I do a lot of hiking and biking in the Poconos. And on the north side of Lake Wallenpaupack, there's a trail that goes out across the top of a little mountain and then down to the lake. And along that trail, there's two things. One, there's a rock, one of those rock walls that goes for a very, very long distance through the woods. I don't know how it got up there, even who built the thing. You know, I like to pretend that native ancestors from the past built that thing. But at the end of that, there's a rock that looks very similar to this. And what Jason and I were talking about the other day is living in a four-season country where you can walk by that rock in the spring and you see some of that moss that's so green and bright. It's just starting to grow up there, and the little white flowers at the base of that rock. But then to see that later on in the summer, when much of the underbrush is starting to grow up and the leaves are full, and then in the fall where things begin to die, and then in the wintertime you see that same rock again with capped in snow. But what's so interesting is that rock and the scene in this particular picture, to me, is enough of a broad canvas that I can picture each of those seasonal images in my mind onto that rock, depending on what, whether I'm sitting in a cold house and having to look at this, or whether I'm too hot and then I'm thinking about that in the summertime. But that rock is so solid, is locked into the ground, but it also holds kind of, to me, a kind of a life, because there's a lot of life images of me and my wife and my kids crawling around that, and my dog jumping up onto that thing. So those are just some of the mindfulness kind of experiential things. And then certainly, since maybe I shouldn't even admit this, but in the wintertime, sometimes we have to run, because it's the one plowed area and you can be off the road. We run the cemetery. And when you run the full length of that 3 times, you can get almost 4 miles in there. But looking across at Bethlehem Steel, even that has I know he's looking down from the chapel on the other side, down across the cemetery. But so many life experiences that get triggered in some of these pictures for me, Jason.
Yeah, and particularly that rock I mentioned. I've been camping in that section of the Adirondacks, which is, vast wilderness with primitive campsites. And this is a rock I've drawn so many times. And for me, it's this beautiful pine needle forest. Pine needles have been building up for years, that it's like 10 feet thick, and it's this spongy, soft material. So even in the black and white, it conjures all those sensations, the smell of those pine needles, and it's great, like visiting old friends with all these pieces, particularly if I go back to the other ones that I do at the Adirondacks. If I can find this here.
Jason, before you leave this picture, comment again about the mention of the haystacks, because I just love that comment when you were making it the other day.
Oh, well, that's what this will be again also to working at different times of the day. I mentioned Monet's haystacks and the fact that, painting the same subject matter at different times of day, completely different colors, different sense of light. And you become so, especially all my local places, Jacobsburg, Lehigh Gap, Bake Oven Knob, Glenanoco, I know exactly where the light's going to be at a certain time of day. I know how to kind of plan my day around these things. And when I was talking about the manic work I was doing here, first thing in the morning, I could be in this Scudic Cove and work on this great sense of light. And then at the end of the day, I have this heavy silhouette shadow. So you almost kind of, organize your day while the light casts. One added note about Acadia that was really tricky and new for me was dealing with tide charts. I was there for 3 weeks. And I would start drawings and then come back and realize, it's not going to look like this again. And there was a certain place called Little Moose Island that if I went out on the island at the wrong time, I'd be stranded out there. So to me, the visual journal is so much about the stories with each of these as well. Maybe we'll move on also to, because you like the Glenanoco piece, and this one here you were mentioning some things about. So you've obviously been to Glenanoco Falls.
Many times.
Many times.
Yes.
And how do you feel about the closure of the trail? And that there's been a lot of incidents and maybe some ignorant people hiking without appropriate footwear and doing foolish things. But I will add that last summer I still continued to go. I didn't hike the trail, but it was beautiful because it was like being in paradise before people arrived. So Glenanoco, which was always inundated with all this foot traffic, is now this glorious gem. And of course, yes, the snakes have come back too. So,
Yeah.
But what did you enjoy about this piece?
A real quick story about Glenanoco. So I'm a mountain biker, and so actually you can get to Glenanoco Falls from the top of the mountain if you drive up above Jim Thorpe and then get onto the some of the old logging roads up there, and it's actually very nice for single track mountain biking. And then you can come. It's quite a trek across there, but then you can come in on the top of Glenanoco Falls, and there's no signs up there from the top that say you can't do it, because most people actually don't even know how to get there from the top. And then you can walk down. I think maybe even one of your students, or somebody, I think it was one of your students that was talking about in one of her journals that that she had found a little trail that went off of the main trail at Glenanoco, and you know where that trail is at. And that trail actually goes all the way up to the top of that mountain too. So I have lots of memories and good feelings about that.
Right.
What I was telling Jason, and I again was kind of reflecting aloud of what art, because part of it is for those who engage in the process of art looking. I'm not an artist, so I have to appreciate what other people stimulate me with. But I was telling him that when I looked at this picture, it kind of caught me in that I've done a lot of hiking over in the skyline over down in Virginia, and there's a number of places where you can get onto the top of the skyline if you start at the bottom through some farmers' fields and some again trails that probably most people wouldn't find. But there's one place that just came so much to mind when I was looking at this, because the whole way up was climbing on those boulders up through this boulder bed to the top of the Skyline Drive, and that's kind of what caught me. But I also appreciated that a picture like this, for some of you, if you look at it, and especially if it was a little bit larger and we were standing in front of it, it catches us at the bottom, down in that pool of water at the bottom. But as we start looking up and we see life flowing down in the form of that water all the way to the very top almost, where there's a small stream and then there's a little bit more of a stream just above the one rounded rock. But I think of a drawing like this, even though the water's coming toward us, that it tends to, for me, draw me into the picture. So that it's after it catches me at the bottom and gives me kind of a nice grounded feeling, I can start to feel safe up there. But once I feel safe at the bottom, I find myself wanting to then start going up that creek bed. And it's not until I get up to the top of that creek bed, even in my visual journeying here, that I begin to see the trees up there. And then trees and forests have a whole different kind of an experience for me, all the way back to reading stories to my kids about going into the forest, and all the hidden kinds of stuff in there, whether nature in there or whether the scary things are like. But again, I'm just saying, boy, this picture just draws you in all the way up to the top, and then all of a sudden, then you realize you're looking at trees up there, and above that, even the sky with that lacy kind of feeling. So those are some of the experiential journeying that Jason's art does for me when I look at that.
Well, that's a great lead into the narrative. And part of the enjoyment, you notice a lot of rocks and structural elements. The more you work from this, you start to see these kind of underlying structural systems. So for example, if I'm the Appalachian Trail or Lehigh Gap, you can see rocks that are broken in half, and you can see how the landscape has changed and imagine how it was and how it's evolved, or being along the Delaware River and seeing how things are eroded. And you start to see these kind of natural patterns. And it does become a narrative story of characters, a sad tree leaning, or, I love, you were mentioning, the dead tree, the rampike in the foreground of that piece. Or you start to think of a story when you're trying to kind of find a location where there becomes a narrative between the elements. And like you said, it's so great to go back to these places and see them at different times and see how they evolve. Maybe to wrap up, and this is maybe a little existential, I was talking about, at this time, are we really starting to understand the true necessity of arts and culture and how important it is to society and civilization? And one of the things I asked, I'm like, I don't know if you want to go in this direction, but when our priorities shift to base needs like food, shelter, personal safety, a lot of people don't have time for creative pursuits, or you start to think about these are the most important things. As I told my students, I said, when you watch The Walking Dead, you don't see a lot of art going on in the background. They're fighting zombies. And so I started thinking about more than ever how these experiences are what keep us civilized, and even just being able to see work like this. And the great things that are happening right now, the virtual museum visits that all these museums all over the world are allowing virtual tours inside, musicians putting on free performances, comedians, all of these things that we're really drawn to and bring us joy because there's such a human aspect to that. And I try to look at a silver lining in times like this, that we start to appreciate things that, being able to, and I know you're getting outside and you would never lose that, but we start to appreciate all of these things. And when it comes time for us to resurface, you hope that people remember these lessons and how important these things are to us.
Yeah. Real quick comment on that, Jason. And some of you, maybe more of the professors who are in here today, may have looked at that list. It was 20 or 25 things when they asked a whole lot of different people, which of these factors in their life do they feel were important for being able to do their jobs and for living, well. And, things like business acumen and kind of ability to read people and things like that, some mechanical skills, things like that were at the very top. And I think it was in 17th place was having some psychologic understanding, which, sort of made me hop and pop a little bit. But at the very bottom of that, it was a little bit about 1.2% of the population queried on this survey said that they thought that art and art appreciation were important for living well. And I found myself feeling kind of sad for the people who don't realize, and maybe I guess if you have to stack everything together in terms of survival, maybe art appreciation and being into the arts maybe falls down there. But I thought by focusing in on art, and especially at a time like this, where, again, it does something to us in so many different ways, in positive ways, and it stimulates our brain in so many ways. And I was talking to a student at Lehigh the other day. We were just, I don't know, for some reason, we just kind of got into chatting back and forth in an early session. And he was saying, he's picked up arts and crafts during this time to just stimulate himself. But he also says he went back to the piano. And as I'm reading that, we're back and forth on email. That was me to do two things. One is I went out and sat down at my own piano and started playing again. And I've been so busy with this that I haven't been playing recently. And then when I was trying to do some improvisational stuff, even, it was like I was trying to get my brain back into shape, finding those. And then after I got done with that, I grabbed my harmonica because I thought, well, I'm not going to frustrate myself as much trying to find the piano keys as I am with my harmonica. But I felt better after doing that. So, but all the different ways that music, that's why I appreciate you saying art and music and all that are just ways for us to still thrive and flourish during a time when our stimulation is more and more restricted. But enjoy.
Yeah. I think one thought to wrap up about that human element, particularly us being teachers, and you're talking about doing counseling and things via the computer, and I'm trying to somehow create a sense of community. And I was telling you how frustrating it is doing these lectures on screen, that I'm just talking to this box. I feel no sense. And I know you, so there's a little bit of a connection here. But how much we miss that aspect, and for all the students who are here, miss you dearly and miss that experience. And I think when you talk about online classes, I don't want to naysay it too much, but it just reinforces how important that one-on-one interaction, the community of creating students. I feel like the lectures I've been posting are kind of personality, and reading a class and critique. Really miss those things and really miss the students. And I hope everybody's doing well through all this. Do you want to take some questions, Stacy?
Great questions that have come through. Asked on Facebook, how do we apply techniques of visual journaling in regards to our dreams? Not static yet, not a life form either. She recently read an article in the New York Times about how frequent dreamers have experienced a higher level of connection during the quarantine. So how can we apply techniques of visual journaling to our dreams?
Well, that's a perfect statement. I didn't tell the full story behind this image, but what this girl explained to me, and absolutely blew my mind, she took out the sketchbook. She wasn't painting Otter Cove. She was doing her own thing. And she proceeded to tell me that this is a picture of her bed and her sleeping in her bed. And then this was a depiction of the dream that she experienced hovering above her as she did that. And the great thing about that was there was no room for interpretation. She didn't care what I thought about it or anybody thought about it. There was just this pure honesty. It was really one of the most amazing experiences I had. So I don't think that quite answered the question. Ian, do you want to talk about visual journaling related to dreams?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question, Julie. I think one of the things that has been most valuable to me is all the way back in grad school, hardly can remember it anymore. I took a dream on, I took a class on dream interpretation, which is a little bit bogus now. I'm thinking back on that. And then I used to teach a psychology of consciousness course up at Colgate. Somebody told me that one of the best things you can do is to start journaling, and that taps right into something Jason has been saying in his talk. So I've kept a dream journal through pretty much all of my life, and by keeping the dream journal and going back and say just even reading through the last week of the journal, and I just keep them in little pads like this, so I can flip the page, when I'm done. I always date it. And it's sitting right beside my bed. You can buy some of those pens that when you start writing, it actually lights up the thing. Quickly to as soon as you're having that dream, you wake up, you write it down, and then go back to sleep. And I have usually no memory of what I wrote down. I read my dream when I wake up on that. But I've been keeping dream journals pretty much all my life. And the neat thing about dream journaling is that after a while, you begin to see the themes of your life. I was teaching a course on Carl Jung for a while, and it was really fascinating to me that probably for about 3 months, I was doing a lot of mandala work in my dreams, and just amazing kind of pictures. For those of you who are artists, you can actually start drawing out the mandalas. If you looked at the sketches of what I tried to draw, you wouldn't even know what you were looking at probably. Until I learned to do that, not looking at the page. Well, I was doing that, Jason. I was doing the drawing without seeing what I was actually drawing when you draw your face. But that would be one of the things I think. In the same way that you can do life journaling, you can do dream journaling, and it can be a really a wonderful experience for a lifetime, actually.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I have a safe back here, the only safe I have in my house. I've been keeping daily journals since I'm 15 years old. And to me, it's probably the most important artifact of my life to be able to do that. But so that's why one of the things I find important, going back to dream journaling, is the written process. Even if you're a musician or an artist, I always tell students, like, make first, think about it later. But I really value that. And even when I was in graduate school, was just like, dumping all this stuff out and then sit back and what is the common thread? And that's the fun thing of going back and seeing all this work years later is starting to see how does it all tie together. And, I still believe, I'll return to abstractions, and I kind of ebb and flow with where I seem to need to go with the work.
One really quick story that made me think of because I was going to make kind of a joke, because when you keep your dream journals and you go see your therapist, you can also share your dreams for therapists who really believe in dream interpretation. But I worked with a student some number of years ago at Lehigh in therapy, and she had gone through some pretty traumatic experiences in her life. And so for the first, this was back in the day when we could do kind of longer term therapy. For almost the first year, she came into the center and just curled up in the chair and really didn't say anything for the full 50 minutes, week after week after week, just, I think, to begin to feel comfortable. And I just sat there with her. About the end of that first year, I asked her one time if she did any drawing, and she said, well, yes. I mean, she kind of looked at me and nodded. And I said, well, it's okay if you would just bring in either something to draw when you're in here, or bring in your pictures to do that. And so for the next year, I have a huge folder of the drawings that she did. And we had talked one time about we should try to publish those, but she only drew for the next year. And then sometimes she would write comments on the back of the pages, and just drawing after drawing after drawing, really drawing out the story of her life and the trauma that she went through. And then as you began to see some of those emerging themes of hope and enlightenment and understanding and reflection that came, it was a powerful process.
For me. A conversation with a musician who was saying that fine art or studio art, there's no intermediate language. So musicians have sheet music. If you're a writer, there's words, and then we understand that. But there's something so visceral about the impact of art that there isn't an intermediate language.
We should go back to Stacy and see what the next questions are.
No, that was a really wonderful response to that question. And I think this is another great question from Mark. What do you think about the kind of focus involved in art making and art viewing, monotasking as it is, versus other kinds of attention we experience, multitasking, especially given the times we find ourselves in with our virtual world?
Well, I'll start out, and I think Ian can follow up with the peak performance and what he does with our athletes. But one of the things I was talking about early on in the video was this sense of project losing track of time. And I think that's kind of one of, Ian, you could back me up on this, like happiness is about flourishing or being in this moment where you're completely fulfilled and kind of lose track of those senses. And one of the things I was mentioning is because of technology, and students, we're all inundated with this information. We're all addicted to checking our phones and our email. But when you step out of that, and a great story is when I went to Acadia, the first 3 days I would check my phone again until I finally realized I wasn't going to get any messages, or I couldn't use the computer. And there's this liberation that occurs in that. So yes, definitely allow you to return to a focus that's very hard to come by in this day and age. Ian?
I really appreciate that question. It is true, the immersive experience in the here and now, and when you know that you've lost yourself, and in a sense, by Csikszentmihalyi that talks about has no good end usually, because it's so attached to desire. But to be in that moment and to immerse yourself, find those moments in your life, and if you can do that, whether you're playing the piano or drawing art or drawing or even playing the game, life, that's the moment where you're flourishing in life, I believe.
I also want to talk about.
I'm
sorry.
I can't see my picture. I did something wrong, but I just joined in. Our class just finished, but I wanted to get involved because when I take students to Italy, we make visual journals, and these visual journals aren't there for them to just kind of put their thoughts during the day, but it's a combination of images and words. Yeah. But also, as Ian was saying, when they sit down and they stare at this, they're sitting in a cafe with a nice drink and incredible atmosphere, and by just getting them to draw something, to look and draw. Like you're saying, life still stills, and birds come landing on them, kids come over. And then when they recollect that image, because they usually write it, it brings a lot more back than a photograph. Because I do this one exercise with them where they all have to be in the piazza and leave from a different portal. And every time they have to make a decision, go right, left, or straight, they have to do a little sketch or a word that tells me why they're doing that. They do that for about 45 minutes. Then they come back, and then I take their little journal and I try to go on the experience. And when I get to that corner, I don't want them to tell me go left, right, but follow the smell of the coffee, or go where the light's on the corner, or see the balcony with the geraniums. Those are the cues that they give me to walk, and it's a much different experience. And I believe a visual journal does that, because there are some things you just can't put down a word for, because it tends to classify what you're seeing. Yeah. So sometimes a quick sketch or a long sketch. A lot of the drawings I have the students do take an hour and a half per sketch. But for that hour and a half, we have a term in Italian called il dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing. They actually sit there and not look at their phone for an hour and a half and draw. And you can see they relax. They're much more there, because usually the phone's drawing them away. So I think the journaling is really great. And I've always loved seeing your journals, Jason, because you just have an ability to be tight and loose at the same time, which is pretty hard to do. When you do a lot of your sketches, do you couple words with them? When you're sketching in your sketchbook, do you combine
Not
words?
really, but I have the companion of the journal. I wanted to add one thought which ties on. I always make this analogy, and maybe you've used this before, but did you ever go grocery shopping and you wrote the list at home and you wrote down all the ingredients, everything you need, and then you forget it at the grocery store, but there's this visual image of that list. And I think that's such an important part of the visual journaling and the things I talk about, that all of this information stays with you. Somebody had asked me about recent work, and I've been inundated with all this, but the last series of drawings I both did were pretty heavy duty. One was my father dying in hospice. The other was my cat being found dead on my stoop. And I had a friend that had arrived and found my cat, was 16 years old, and I didn't know what to do. And I said, I know exactly what I need to do. And it sounds morbid and unusual for an artist to do that, but in both of those situations, there's a memory that was the way that I had to do it. And these are things I have no intention on showing anyone, or it's such a personal, a personal thing to do. But for me, that's the way I capture these memories, and they most strongly resonate through creation of sketches. Somber note.
Jason, there was a question about your process from Marianne Riker on Facebook. Are you using Mylar for sketching? What is the surface?
Right. Somebody else asked that. If you go to Blick, it's actually called Yupo paper, Y-U-P-O, and it was originally designed for drafting. And my story about this is, in Tony's architecture studio, maybe like 10 years ago, a student had used a lot of Mylar. Tony does those beautiful graphite drawings. But I just found this scrap of this paper and found, just experimenting, that it was oddly receptive to ink and water-based materials, which sounds unusual for a substrate, which is essentially plastic. So it is Yupo paper. And if anybody is using this, it's available in different thicknesses of stock. So when I had my first exhibition of these, I found out the hard way that these beautiful large-scale drawings, when done on the thinner stock, get all warped and bubbly. So you can get this at like 150-pound stock. I will warn you that it's temperamental. If you get any greases from your finger, oils on your finger on it, it doesn't become receptive to the surface. But one of my tricks with these drawings, and you can see how I build it up here, is I actually found out that I can use a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser sponge to subtract ink. So I've always loved India ink, because like now I have the ability to erase it, but I have a love-hate relationship with the polypropylene, because it is temperamental. I've done drawings on the opposite side, that when I work back into it with water, it doesn't adhere to the surface. So certainly fun to play with. Thank you, Marianne. Thanks for coming.
So one last question before we wrap up for both of you. You talk about kind of the personal experience of journaling and the importance of what it does for your well-being, and that many of your students come to you, this may be their first art class, or for those of us who are interested in kind of getting started in visual journaling, what are some pointers that you have? I know I myself and others might feel intimidated a little bit that it has to be, you know, the finest art, right? What are some tips to just really get started?
You know, I talked a lot about the blind contours in the video and how I'm so drawn to that experience because I know my students are working remotely on figure drawing, and it's kind of a curse word in my class. I try not to have them use contour lines because I know I'm going to see all these cartoony contour line drawings. So I do everything in my power to create restrictions for them. So I have them do things like draw with their opposite hand, draw with a 3-foot long stick, use a big mass of charcoal that you can't control. So my suggestion is doing things that are kind of against what you would think are obvious, which is trying to capture the subject in a realistic way and make it fun for yourself. That's what I love about blind contours and continuous line. There's a tactile joy of doing that. And I say this from experience. If I was in college, I probably wouldn't have liked those things either. And to be able to, you know, so for me, it was so liberating from doing these tight things where, you know, the pinnacle of art making was creating a photorealistic drawing. And then all of a sudden, I remember my teachers responding to these and be like, these are great. I'm like, really? These take me no time at all. I'm getting A's. This is cake. But I didn't realize what was so wonderful about these drawings. So I think for visual journaling, just do it any way that you want. You know, I have a friend I go camping with, and every once in a while I'll say, or just grab a sheet of paper. If you haven't drawn, give it a shot. You know, so don't be concerned about the product and just record. You know, I think that's the concern. High school art classes, you're doing these long process-oriented things where you spend 4 months, you get a new canvas, you don't want to ruin it. Get some throwaway paper and just, you know, throw down and see what happens.
One real quick comment too, from as a non-artist, is find a nephew or niece that's real young and go out and buy some colored painting boxes or something for them, or get some chalk or get a coloring book, and then sit down with that child and start drawing the same kind of stuff that they're using. That's one of the ways that I most enjoy doing any art that I ever did was with my kids, because you know, it's like the stuff's all on the table and they're like, Daddy, you know, it's like, what are you going to draw? So then I had to draw too, and it was fun going all the way back to first and second grade doing some of my own drawing on paper.
And the subject can be anything. I put these in, this was my college roommate, and he's got 3 kids out in Long Island. And when he's stuck at recitals and things, he's always got his sketch pad and his pen. Any opportunity is an opportunity
That's right.
to observe and create.
Yeah.
That's a great thing to end on. Any opportunity is a great opportunity to create, right? So I think that you have given us some wonderful things to think about and opportunity to start being creative at home, and to think about how visual journaling can be used for both personal and professional practice. Thank you both so much for joining us today and for sharing all of your experience. And thank you for all of our participants who are listening through Zoom and Facebook. We hope that you will join us for our upcoming series. We have one this coming Saturday with Deirdre Murphy, where she will be talking about her own work. And Hawk Mountain Sanctuary will also be joining us with a hawk to show us how to draw a hawk and then create our own artwork inspired by Deirdre's. And then on April 28th, we will have Anthony Viscardi and Tim Higgins. And that will be the conclusion of our Art and Dialogue series for this spring, but we have a lot of great programs coming up. So please stay tuned, check back often, and thank you again for joining us today. And thank you again, Jason and Ian.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Ian.
It was a pleasure. Good, nice and